Chapter 5 The End of Everything. Prologue. The Quiet Before the Storm. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and ancient stone as the ranger stepped lightly over the uneven ground. Strange followed beside her, his cloak billowing ever so slightly with each calculated step. This was supposed to be a simple task, nothing extraordinary, nothing universe-shattering. Just a retrieval mission, an old text hidden deep within the ruins of a forgotten temple, rumored to contain insights into lost magic, something Strange could study, something the ranger could interpret with her unique perception of the world. A quiet moment of purpose, free from the weight of war and gods and cosmic forces. Or so they believed. But they were not alone. Something watched. Something waited. The first god had not left. It had not retreated into the void. It had learned. And she was the key. But not yet. Not yet. An unassuming ruin. Are you sure this is the right place? The ranger glanced at Strange as they reached the entrance of the ancient ruin. The worn stone archway loomed over them, its carvings nearly faded by time. But the feeling remained, the air heavy with something old. Strange hummed and thought, his fingers tracing the lingering sigil in the air. It glowed faintly before fading, as if swallowed by the presence of the ruin itself. This is it. The ranger crossed her arms. It doesn't feel like much. That's what concerns me, Strange admitted, stepping forward. Magic always leaves a trace, but here, he frowned, here it's like something is waiting to be remembered. The ranger exhaled, rolling her shoulders. Well, isn't that exactly why we're here? To find out what was forgotten? Strange gave her a sidelong glance. You have a habit of simplifying things in ways that make me deeply uncomfortable. She smirked. It's a talent. He sighed. Let's just get this over with. Something watches. The ruin was still, the kind of quiet that was unnatural. Not peaceful, not abandoned, just watching. The first god did not move. It did not need to. It had seen what it needed to see. The sorcerer was strong, yes, but strength was irrelevant. The trickster was dangerous, but even he did not know what he had done. The ranger. She was the anomaly. A being that should have been insignificant, a mortal, a flicker in time. And yet, she had changed something. The first god had felt a shift, had tasted the echo of something new. Not a threat, not a challenge, but a possibility. It would wait. It would understand. And when the time was right, it would decide. The first step. Strange. The ranger's voice cut through the silence, and the sorcerer supreme looked up. She was staring at something half buried beneath the dust, hidden in the fractures of the temple floor. A sigil. Faint, ancient, pulsing just beneath the surface. Strange stepped closer, extending a hand, but the moment his fingers hovered above it, the sigil reacted. Not to him. To her. A pulse of power rippled outwards, the sigil flaring to life as the stone shifted beneath them, energy cracking through the ruin like something stirring awake. And in the void, the first god smiled. It was time. The beginning of the end. Something shifted. A flicker, so brief, so fleeting, that the ranger barely registered it. A shadow at the edge of her mind, a presence that was not her own, brushing past her soul like silk. And then? Gone. Her breath hitched, her fingers twitched, a shiver ran down her spine. But when she turned to look, nothing. The sigil beneath her feet faded, its glow retreating like embers suffocated by the wind. The temple was silent once more, as if it had never woken. But it had. Something had changed. Something had entered her, and he knew it. The first god takes his prize. She was his. At long last, after eons of waiting, of being sealed away, of being forgotten, he was inside her. Not in the way of possession, not in the way of a parasite, but in the way of something old, something patient, something that had been waiting for the perfect moment. He had not forced his way in. He had been welcomed, not by choice, not by knowledge, but by fate itself. And now he would taste this existence, learn what she was. Learn while the trickster's magic had changed her. And when the time was right, when he had all the knowledge he needed, he would take back what was his. This universe, this existence, and his revenge. The echo of dread. Far from the ruin, across realms, across time itself, Loki froze. A shudder ran through him, deep, cold, wrong. Not fear, not pain, but something far worse. An instinctive knowing something had happened, something bad, something he could not see, could not name, could not grasp. But he felt it, like a scream in the void, like a thread being cut and rewoven without his knowledge. His fingers clenched around the arm of his chair, his breath slow, controlled, but his heart pounded. He did not know what had changed, but he knew one thing for certain. It had to do with her. And if something had touched what was his, then whoever was responsible would suffer for it. The unseen battle begins. The ranger shook her head, trying to shake the feeling, the strange aftertaste of whatever had just happened. Strange was watching her, sharp-eyed, analyzing, already suspecting something was off. But he did not know. Not yet. The first god remained silent, watching, waiting, amused, because this was only the beginning, and soon they would all understand what it truly meant to awaken him. The quiet before the storm. Stranger's gaze lingered on the ranger for a moment longer than necessary. She was still, her eyes distant, as if listening for something neither of them could hear. Something about that sigil had touched her. He knew it, he felt it. But the moment had passed. The glow had faded. The temple's hum of power dissolved into nothing. The ranger blinked, then shook her head slightly. Well, that was weird. Strange arched a brow. That's putting it lightly. She gave him a small smirk, but there was something off about it. A fraction of a second too slow, an almost imperceptible hesitation. He noted it, but then it was gone. The temple was silent once more, the sigil nothing but dead stone beneath their feet. And Strange exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Whatever it was, it's gone now. Gone, or so he thought. The sigil's secret. They moved forward, stepping past the now dormant sigil and deeper into the ruin's heart. The air was cool, the scent of old parchment, dust, and forgotten knowledge lingering in the stillness. Strange raised a hand, conjuring a soft glow to light the way as they reached what appeared to be an altar. The scrolls rested atop it, untouched, undisturbed for what could have been centuries. Strange ran his fingers along the stone, his gaze narrowing. There's no trap, no curse, just a forgotten vault. The ranger crossed her arms. You sound disappointed. Strange smirked slightly. Perhaps I was expecting more. You always do. His smirk lingered, but he said nothing. Instead, he carefully lifted the first scroll, unraveling it just enough to inspect the markings. Ancient runes. A language nearly lost to time. Interesting. The ranger stepped closer, peering over his shoulder. What does it say? Strange tilted his head, reading carefully. It's a chronicle of sorts, a record of a lost age, something about a great change. His brow furrowed. Something about the words bothered him. They were familiar, too familiar. He turned to the second scroll, unraveling it with greater urgency, his eyes scanning the faded ink, and then he froze. Because there, woven between the lines of forgotten history, was a symbol he knew. The very sigil that had flared to life beneath the ranger's feet. The moment passes. The ranger glanced at him. Strange? He didn't answer at first. His fingers brushed over the symbol, his mind racing. A sigil with no recorded meaning, a sigil that should have been dead magic, a sigil that had responded to her. A flicker of unease passed through him. But the scrolls held no power now. The sigil had lost its spark, and the temple, just a ruin once more. Strange exhaled slowly, rolling the scroll up and tucking it away. Nothing, just... He shook his head. More questions for another time. The ranger studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Let's finish what we came for then. And with that, they gathered the remaining scrolls, placing them carefully into Strange's satchel. Mission complete. Nothing to worry about. Nothing left behind. Except, deep within the ranger's mind, unseen, unnoticed, something smiled. And waited. The Watcher in the Shadows. The portal shimmered, golden light, bending reality as Strange and the ranger stepped through, leaving the ruins behind. The moment they crossed the threshold into the Sanctum Sanctorum, the cool stillness of the temple was replaced by the familiar hum of contained magic. The scent of parchment, aged wood, and something unnameable, yet distinctly Strange's own. The mission was over. The scrolls were secured. Everything was as it should be. And yet, Loki was waiting. The trickster's suspicion. He stood near the grand staircase, arms folded, expression unreadable. Not lounging, not smirking, waiting. His emerald gaze swept over them both, slow, deliberate. He saw nothing out of place. No wound, no corruption, no lingering traces of foreign magic. Everything was as it should be. And yet, that feeling remained. The one that had jolted through him across realms, deep and unshakable, as if something had slipped through the cracks of reality and into something he could not see. Loki did not like what he could not see, and so he watched and he waited. But nothing was there. Not yet. A moment of normalcy. Strange set his satchel down on a nearby table, rolling his shoulders. I assume you didn't drop by just to admire my home, Loki. Loki's lips curled slightly, but the amusement did not reach his eyes. What an assumption, dear sorcerer. I would never waste my time on such trivial things. The ranger smirked slightly, shaking her head. And yet here you are. Loki's gaze flicked to her, paused. A hesitation so brief, so imperceptible, that no one would have noticed. No one but himself. Because there was nothing wrong, nothing to see, nothing to sense. And yet, for a fleeting moment, something inside him whispered, "Look again." But when he did, there was nothing to find. Unseen and waiting. The first god was still, silent. The trickster was clever, yes, perceptive, but he was not all-seeing. Not yet. And the first god was patient. He could wait. Because time meant nothing to him. Because this world was already his. He only needed them to realize it. And when they did, it would be far too late. The illusion of peace. The Sanctum Sanctorum was quiet. For once there was no pressing threats, no ripples in reality to mend, no urgent calls from the Avengers demanding strangers' intervention. Just the three of them. A sorcerer, a ranger, a trickster. And the thing that waited. Unseen, unfelt, smiling. A conversation over wine. Strange poured himself a drink, swirling the dark liquid in his glass before leaning against the grand wooden table. His sharp eyes flickered towards the ranger. So, the sigil. She glanced at him over the rim of her own glass, thoughtful. What about it? It reacted to you. She exhaled, rolling her shoulders. It did. But not to me. The words lingered just a second too long. Loki, perched in his usual spot near the fire, lazy twirling his own goblet of Asgardian wine, did not look at them. But he was listening. The ranger shrugged. Maybe it's because I touched it first. Maybe it was just old magic looking for someone to answer. Strange frowned slightly. That's not how magic works. Isn't it? Not when I'm standing right there and it ignores me completely. Loki took a slow sip of his wine, his gaze flickering towards them. Are you jealous, Strange? The sorcerer shot him a glare. Jealous? No. Cautious? Always. The ranger smirked. Are you sure? Because it sounds like you're sulking. I don't sulk. Oh, you sulk, Loki mused, a smirk playing at the edge of his lips. You sulk magnificently. Strange rolled his eyes, taking another sip of his drink. The tension eased. For a moment it was just conversation, just a comfort, the rare moment of companionship they had built despite themselves. But deep inside, something watched, something listened, and something waited. Loki's unsettling instinct. He didn't trust this feeling. It was nothing. It was everything. The sensation hadn't returned. That ice-cold whisper in his bones, the phantom warning that had jolted through him back in the sanctuary. But something felt off. Not enough to grasp, not enough to act on. Just enough to be aware of. Loki's emerald gaze flicked toward the ranger again, studying her profile in the firelight. She was the same. Her presence, her heartbeat, her essence. All exactly as they had always been. No corruption. No changes. Nothing. And yet, something was there. He could not see it, could not touch it, could not find it. And that was what unsettled him the most. Because if he could not find it, he could not stop it. His fingers tapped once again the rim of his goblet. It was nothing. It was everything. But there was no proof, and so he let it go. For now. The first god smiled. Hidden, silent, patient. The first god did not move, did not breathe, did not stir. Because it did not need to. It had already won. They simply did not know it yet. And so it watched, it waited, it smiled. Because time was nothing to it. And soon they would all understand. The calm before the fall. Weeks passed, then months, and life continued, as if nothing had changed, as if nothing had awakened, as if something wasn't waiting. The first god was patient. He watched them fight their battles, he watched them win their victories, he watched them laugh, breathe, live. And all the while, he simply smiled, because time was nothing to him. And soon, they would all understand. A normal day for a trickster and a ranger. You know, this was supposed to be a quiet mission. The ranger rolled sideways, barely dodging the flaming sword that nearly cleaved through the stone beneath her. Loki, all sharp grins and dangerous ease, twisted his dagger through the air, catching the blade of the enemy mid-swing before shoving them back with a pulse of seething green magic. Yes, well, he mused, you should know by now that quiet is never in the cards when I'm involved. The ranger half flipping to her feet. And yet I still hope. The battlefield was chaos. They had been sent to retrieve an artifact before it fell to the hands of a particularly arrogant warlord who thought himself worthy of ancient power. Standard job, nothing unusual, nothing cosmic, just another day in the office. Loki vanished in a swirl of magic, reappearing behind the warlord with a smirk that spoke of incoming pain. The ranger moved instantly, ducking between enemies, striking with precision. A well-practiced dance that she and Loki had perfected over time. And in the end, they won, as they always did. Another mission completed. Another knight returning victorious. And the first god watched. And he waited. A sorcerer's endless work. No, Wong, I'm not taking another student. Strange rubbed his temple, exhaustion creeping in as he closed yet another dimensional rift that had appeared unexpectedly near the coast of Norway. Wong gave him a pointed look. You are the Sorcerer Supreme. You cannot handle everything alone. I am aware, Strange muttered, tracing a sigil in the air to reinforce the barrier between realms. That's why I'm delegating. To you. Wong sighed. Delegating does not mean ignoring. Semantics. Another day. Another rift to mend. Another artifact to secure. Another fool trying to tear reality apart because they thought they could play God. Strange was used to it. This was his life, his duty. And nothing felt out of place. Nothing felt wrong. And yet, the first god watched. Still, patient, knowing. Because the more time passed, the more they would all forgot to look over their shoulders. And that was when the game would truly begin. The illusion of normalcy. Loki and the Ranger fought their battles. Strange protected the multiverse. The days bled together, everything felt as it always had. And so they moved on. They stopped questioning the moment in the ruins. They stopped wondering about the sigil. They stopped searching for something that did not want to be found. And the first god smiled. Because time was his greatest ally. And when the time came, he would be ready. And they would never see it coming. The moment everything changed. Loki felt warmth. The kind that was rare for him, the kind he had spent centuries avoiding because it was dangerous, because it made him weak. And yet here he was, wrapped in it, in her arms around the woman who had somehow become his entire world without him realizing it. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the stone walls of his sanctuary. The waterfall outside whispered against the night, a steady rhythm matching her breath. She was his anchor, the one constant in the maelstrom of his existence. He buried his face against her hair, inhaling her scent, feeling the steady thrum of life beneath his fingertips. She was here. She was his. And for once in his long cursed life, he was happy. Then she moved. Her fingers traced along his arm, her breath warm against his skin. And then, slowly, she lifted her head, and everything went cold. Not her. Loki froze. The instant he met her gaze, every fiber of his being screamed in warning, because those eyes were not her eyes. They were wrong. Too deep, too vast. A void stretching into something endless, ancient, and grinning. Hello, trickster. The voice was not hers. It slithered from her lips, but did not belong to the woman he held. Loki's blood ran cold. His breath hitched, his entire body tensing as the weight of realization slammed into him like a blade to the chest. She was gone. And in her place, he had returned. The first god had taken her, and Loki, god of lies, of trickery, of chaos, of war, had never known fear like this. The sorcerer feels it. Across the realms, in the Sanctum Sanctorum, Stranger's eyes snapped open. His heart skipped a beat, then another, as if an ice-cold claw had wrapped around his chest and squeezed. His breath hitched, his fingers clenching against the sheets, as a ripple of magic shattered through the very air. He didn't know what had happened, but something had. Something so wrong, so impossible that it had touched even him. The air in his chambers was heavy, as if a presence had passed through and left nothing but cold silence in its wake. Strange sat up, pressing a hand against his chest, his pulse thunderous in his ears. He was not alone. Something had changed. Something had been taken. And across the realms, Loki was about to burn the world to the ground to get her back. The breaking of a god. Loki stumbled back, his breath shallow, his pulse thundering in his ears. His magic flared instinctively, crackling at his fingertips, but he did not strike, because this was not a battle he could win. He knew it. And worse, the first god knew it too. The being that wore her face, that stared at him through eyes that were not hers, did not move, did not attack, did not need to, because he was enjoying this every moment. Every second that Loki's world crumbled into dust. Every flicker of raw, soul-shattering agony that twisted through his body as the truth settled deep into his bones. The ranger was gone, and he felt it. Not just the loss, but the absence. Like something had reached into his very being and ripped her away. Not stolen, not held captive. Erased. As if she had never been. And Loki, the trickster, the liar, the god who had always had a way out, had no way to bring her back. He knew it. The first god knew it. And the way he smiled through her lips was a knife driven deep into Loki's chest. The moment of fear. The first god tilted her head, slow, patient, enjoying this, enjoying Loki breaking. "Ah," he murmured, her voice curling through the silence like silk. "So you finally understand." Loki's hand shook. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting shadows that twisted unnaturally against the walls of his sanctuary. His sanctuary. Their sanctuary. And she was gone. He barely registered the way his knees hit the stone floor, the way his breath hitched, the way his entire world collapsed in on itself. There was nothing left to fight, because this was beyond him. He was not enough. And the first god knew it. "Do you feel it, trickster?" The being in her body stepped forward, amusement flickering through that mockery of her voice. "The emptiness, the helplessness." Loki said nothing, because he couldn't. There were no words for this, only pain, only defeat, only loss. "I could break you further," the first god continued thoughtfully. "But why?" A slow smile. "You are already broken." The sorcerer arrives. Across the realms, on Earth, Strange's heart raced. Something was wrong, very wrong. His hands trembled as he reached for the nearest artifact, searching for what had woken him. For the sensation that still clung to him like ice. It was fear, not his own, but Loki's. And that was not possible. Because Loki did not fear, not like this, not enough to shake the very fabric of reality. Strange exhaled sharply, his hands tracing the air, a portal forming instinctively. Before he even knew, he stepped through it. And then he was there. The moment he crossed the threshold, the moment his boots touched the stone floor of Loki's sanctuary, he felt it. The sheer wrongness. Like the air itself had been poisoned by something that should not exist. And then he saw him. The face of a broken god. Loki was on his knees. His head hung low, his hands limp at his sides. His entire body shaking, as if he had been shattered from the inside out. This was not the Loki he knew. This was not the god who smirked in the face of destruction, who twisted every loss into an advantage. This was a man who had lost everything. And Strange felt the weight of it instantly. The hair on the back of his neck rose, his breath hitching as he turned. And then he saw her. No, not her. The first god. And Strange shivered. Because for the first time in his existence, the Sorcerer Supreme felt something that no amount of training, no battle with Dormammu, no war against cosmic forces could have ever prepared him for. He felt dread. Because he recognized what had happened. He had seen possession before, had seen the influence of dark magic, the touch of cosmic horrors. But this was not possession. This was occupation, and the being that stared at him through the ranger's eyes, it was smiling. Because this was not a battle. Not yet. This was a warning. And Loki had already lost. The price of a god. Loki was on his knees. The weight of defeat settled deep into his bones, an unbearable weight pressing against him, crushing him beneath the sheer wrongness of it all. For the first time in his immortal existence, he knew he had lost. There was no trick, no illusion, no clever escape waiting just beyond reach. He had failed. And now she was gone. But then something shifted. A flicker, a whisper, a warmth like firelight in the cold abyss of despair. A voice that was not his own, yet one he knew. I'm here. The world curled through his mind like embers in the dark. You can still save her. Loki's breath hitched. His fingers twitched. Because he knew that voice. He had heard it before. Ancient, pure. The magic. The power that had chosen him. The power that had awakened once before. The power that was his to command. The trickster's dilemma. Loki's heart pounded as he reached inward, stretching toward that flickering warmth, that glimmer of hope in the abyss. And the magic answered. Use me. The words were soft but absolute. I am at your command. Loki exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening into fists. He could do this. He could bring her back. He could undo what had been done. But then, to use my full power, the voice whispered, you must give up your greatest power. Loki froze. A slow, sickening dread coiled in his chest. He already knew what it meant, what the price was, and it was too much. The ultimate sacrifice. Loki shook his head, his breathing uneven. No. The magic was patient. That is the cost. His pulse thundered in his ears, his throat tightening. There must be another way. There is not. The voice was not cruel. It was not unkind. It was simply truth. To save her, he must lose her, not just her presence, not just her touch, her voice, her laughter, but everything. Every battle fought side by side, every trial endured together, every moment shared, every whisper of love, every aching glance, every quiet breath stolen between wars and chaos and the endless tides of fate. Gone. Erased. She would live. But in his world, she would have never existed. Loki's chest ached. This was too much. Too cruel. How could he choose this? But then he looked up, and he saw her face. No, his face. The first god mocking him, wearing her form like a sick, twisted joke, feeding on the very pain that was consuming him. And he knew this wasn't a fair fight. It never had been. And Loki had never been one to play fair. The trickster's choice. His fists unclenched, his magic stilled, his breathing steadied. Fine. The world shuddered. Strange, still standing at the edge of the room, felt it instantly. A shift so profound, so fundamental, that the very balance of the universe tilted. Like something had just rewritten itself. like something ancient had just been unraveled. Loki stood, and as he did, the world around him changed. The fire flared, the air trembled, the shadows shrank away. And Strange, sorcerer supreme, master of the mystic arts, keeper of the multiverse, felt power like nothing he had ever witnessed before. Loki was changing. No, the world was changing around him, and in that moment, everything was undone. The end of the first god. Strange staggered back, not from fear, not from the sheer wrongness of what was unfolding before him, but from power. A power so immense, so absolute, that it pressed against the very fabric of reality. A force so raw and unrestrained that Strange, sorcerer supreme, master of the mystic arts, felt himself shrink before it. And the first god felt it too. For the first time, it knew fear. It had spent aeons watching. It had waited. It had studied. And yet, it had never accounted for this. For him, for Loki. Not like this. Not unbound. Not limitless. Not a god. But something else entirely. Something that should not be. And as the first god stared into the unrelenting storm that surged within Loki, for the first time since its birth, it knew what it was to be the prey. The final strike. Loki did not move at first. He stood there, calm, silent, watching. The power surged through him, bending the very air around him, making the room tremble, as if the universe itself was reacting to his presence. Strange couldn't breathe. The first god couldn't comprehend. And then Loki moved. So fast, so seamlessly, that Strange barely registered it. He stepped forward, no, through the Ranger, through the first god that had made her its vessel. And with a single, impossibly swift movement, he ripped it out of her. A soundless scream, a void shattering. A presence that had existed before time itself, torn from existence. Loki didn't just banish it, didn't just seal it away. He erased it. Utterly, completely. As if it had never been. And that was the impossible. The aftermath. The Ranger slammed to the ground, her body weak, trembling, hollow. She had seen everything. She had felt everything. The moment Loki's power that had touched the first god, she had been there, caught in the vast storm of his will. And she had watched as he had ended it. Not with rage, not with cruelty, but with finality, for her. And then he had turned to look at her. She lifted her gaze, desperate, aching, needing to see the man she loved, the man who had torn apart the fabric of the cosmos to bring her back. And when he looked down at her, there was nothing. No warmth, no recognition, no flicker of relief, of joy, of love. Just a god looking at a stranger. The Ranger's heart shattered. Because she knew. Oh gods, she knew. The moment of loss. Strange watched, unable to speak, unable to process what he had just witnessed. Loki had done the impossible. He had erased something that should not have been erasable, had rewritten reality itself in a way that even Strange, with all his knowledge, could not comprehend. And then he had turned to him. Loki met Strange's eyes, his expression steady, as if none of this had mattered to him, as if this had been just another task, another battle. He nodded once, a simple gesture. Then, without a word, he vanished. The woman who remembered. The ranger sat frozen, her breath ragged, her hands trembling. She barely heard Strange moving toward her, barely felt the warmth of his presence as he knelt beside her. Her world was collapsing. Not because she had been taken, not because she had almost been lost, but because of Loki. Her Loki no longer knew her. Every battle, every quiet moment, every whispered word, every promise, every time she had reached for him and he had been there, gone. She was nothing to him now. And she remembered everything. A broken return. The portal shimmered, folding reality on itself, as Strange and the ranger stepped through, leaving Loki's sanctuary behind. The moment they crossed the threshold, the air of the Sanctum Sanctorum felt different. Not safer, not warmer, just empty. As if something had been taken from the world, leaving only a hollow echo in its wake. Strange barely heard the portal seal shut behind them. His mind was too full. Too many questions. Too many impossibilities. Too many pieces of reality that did not add up. But none of that mattered now, because she was breaking. The weight of loss. The ranger stood motionless, her back to him, her breathing uneven. She had not spoken, had not moved since Loki had vanished. Strange exhaled slowly, removing his cloak, draping it over a chair before stepping forward. You should sit down. Nothing. You should rest. Still nothing. Strange hesitated, watching the way her hands trembled at her sides, how her shoulders shook, how the weight of everything pressed down on her like a collapsing star. He had seen grief before, had seen people lose those they loved. But this was different. This was worse. Because he had seen Loki look at her, and he had seen what wasn't there. The very foundation of her world had shattered. And she was the only one left to remember it. The breaking point. Strange moved carefully, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. Ranger. The moment he spoke, she broke. A sharp inward breath. A tremble that turned into a shudder, and then she collapsed. Not from injury, not from exhaustion, but from the sheer weight of loss. Strange caught her, lowering them both to the floor as her body shook with silent sobs. He didn't speak, didn't offer false comfort, didn't tell her it would be okay, because it wouldn't. Not now. Maybe not ever. So he did the only thing he could. He stayed, a steady presence, a reminder that she was not alone, even as she grieved for a man who had forgotten her. The silence between them. Minutes passed, then longer. The ranger's sobs faded, turning into ragged breath, turning into silence. Strange didn't move, didn't let go, because he knew this was not something to fix. This was something to survive. And when she finally spoke, Her voice was so small, so quiet that he'd almost missed it. "He's gone." Strange closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "He's alive," he corrected, his voice gentle. "But yes, he's gone." She shuddered, nodding once, but said nothing more. Because what else was there to say? The long night ahead. Strange carefully helped her to her feet, guiding her toward one of the sanctum's quiet rooms, a space untouched by magic, untouched by anything except peace. "You need rest," he murmured. "Sleep if you can. I'll be close." She didn't argue, didn't resist. Just nodded once, stepping into the room, closing the door behind her. Strange let out a slow, controlled breath. His fingers curled at his sides. And for the first time in a long, long time, he felt helpless. Because he could mend wounds. He could stabilize reality. He could fight gods and monsters alike. But he could not fix this. He could only be here. And hope that somehow, some way, they would both find a way to live with the weight of what had been lost. A hollow victory. Loki stood amidst the ruins of a battlefield, the stench of burnt earth and spent magic lingering in the air. The bodies of those who had challenged him lay scattered, the echoes of their defeat fading into the wind. Another battle, another meaningless fight, one he would barely remember, one that did not matter. And yet, something felt different. He could not name it, could not grasp it. It was not pain, not loss, not anything he had ever felt before, but it was there. An emptiness, a space within him that should not have been empty, and no matter how he tried to ignore it, it would not go away. The god who had everything and nothing. Loki exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark, sweat-dampened hair, as he surveyed the remnants of the skirmish. His warriors cheered somewhere in the distance, a victory, another pointless victory. He should have felt triumphant, should have smirked, should have relished the moment. But all he felt was cold, as if something had been taken from him, as if something vital had been erased. He did not know what it was, only that it should have been there, but it was not. An unshakable feeling. The feeling did not leave him, not when he returned to Asgard, not when he sat upon the golden throne, surrounded by power, by admiration, by everything he had ever desired, not when he walked through the halls of this palace, through chambers filled with relics, with knowledge, with the secrets of God and man alike. He had everything. So why did it feel like he had nothing? Why was there a piece missing? Why? Why did he feel like something had once been there, something important? And now it was simply gone. The weight of what he cannot remember. Loki stood at the balcony of his chambers, overlooking the vast expanse of the cosmos, his fingers lightly tapping against the railing. His mind would not be still. No matter how he tried to push the feeling aside, no matter how he buried himself in distractions, the emptiness remained. A dull, gnawing ache. A whisper of something lost. And he did not know why. He did not know what. He only knew that he could not fill it. And he did not know if he ever would. The hunt for something lost. The dream shattered, the golden throne, the halls of Asgard, the admiration, the reverence. Gone. Loki opened his eyes, exhaling sharply as the illusion faded into the cold emptiness of reality. The throne had never been his, it had only been a distraction, a weak attempt to fill the void. But the hole inside him remained. And Loki, a god who had once thrived in chaos, who had carved his name into the bones of history, could not live with that emptiness. So he did what he did best. He hunted. A storm unleashed. Loki tore through the 9 realms like a wildfire, leaving nothing but ashes and whispers in his wake. Every enemy that had ever challenged him, every being that had ever dared to stand in his way, they all fell before him. None of them stood a chance, because Loki was unhinged. Because Loki was relentless. Because no one could stop a god who had nothing to lose. And the 9 realms trembled. Because wherever Loki appeared, it was the end. And yet, he felt nothing. No matter how many he destroyed, no matter how many battles he won, no matter how many monsters, tyrants, and warlords he erased from existence, the emptiness remained. That one space inside him, still aching, still waiting, still missing something, something he could not remember. The realms whisper his name. The realms spoke of him in fear. The trickster was gone. The god of chaos had become something else, something unrelenting, something merciless. A force that did not barter, manipulate, or scheme. A force that simply erased. Because Loki did not care anymore. Because Loki was searching. For what he did not know. Only that he had to find it. And until he did, the 9 realms would suffer. A safe house, a broken soul, and an archer's promise. The air was still. The distant hum of the city barely reached this far. This quiet, hidden corner of the world, where no one would think to look. Strange had chosen the safe house well. It was far away from everything. From the chaos, from the gods, from the wreckage of what had been lost. And as the portal flickered shut behind them, Clint Barton leaned against the worn wooden table, arms crossed, watching them both carefully. Watching her. The ranger stood motionless, silent, as if the world no longer felt real to her. As if she was afraid to breathe, afraid to move. Afraid that if she did, she would shatter completely. And for the first time since Strange had stepped through the portal, Clint truly understood. The weight of truth. Clint let out a slow, sharp breath, running a hand through his hair as he stared at Strange. "So let me get this straight," he said, his voice edged with disbelief. "Loki wiped out a god. Actually, no, he erased it, and then just what? Forgot about her?" Strange folded his arms. "Not just forgot. The magic took everything, every memory, every connection. To him, she never existed." Clint's stomach dropped. He looked at the ranger again. Her distant stare, the way her hands trembled ever so slightly, the way she seemed lost in a world only she could see. Clint had seen broken people before. He had seen grief. He had lived it. But this? This was something else. This was a woman who had lost everything. But the cruelest part? She was the only one who remembered it. And that kind of pain, That kind of isolation. It would destroy her if no one pulled her back. A promise without words. Clint sighed, rubbing the back of his neck before stepping forward. He kept his movement slow, careful, treating her like a wounded animal that might bolt at any moment. "Hey, Ranger," he said softly. "You hungry?" She didn't answer, didn't acknowledge him. Strange exhaled, shaking his head. She hasn't said much since it happened. Clint watched her for a long moment. Then he pulled out a chair, sat down and leaned forwards, resting his forearms on the table. "Well, guess what?" His voice was steady, grounded. "You don't have to talk, but you do have to eat. So I'm gonna make some coffee, maybe find some actual food in this place, and then you and we're gonna sit and we're gonna deal with this. Got it?" The ranger's shoulders tensed, just barely. A flicker of recognition in her distant eyes. Clint didn't press, didn't push. He just nodded, standing, moving towards the kitchen with purpose, as if this was just another normal day. Because sometimes that was what people like them needed the most. Something normal to hold on to. Something that wasn't loss, wasn't magic, wasn't gods, and the impossible choices and broken fates. Just something real. And he would be damned if he would let her fall apart on his watch. The sorcerer's departure. Strange watched the exchange carefully. Watched the way Clint spoke without forcing her to respond. Watched the way the ranger's shoulders shifted, just slightly, as if the weight pressing down on her had lifted a fraction. Strange new loss. But Clint knew how to handle it. And that was why he had brought her here. He sighed, rolling his shoulder. "She's safe with you?" Clint nodded. "Yeah, I got her." Strange exhaled through his nose, looking back at the ranger one last time. She didn't look at him, didn't move. But he had the feeling she knew he was leaving. Knew that this was her fight now. With a slow, steady breath, Strange raised a hand, summoning a portal. "I'll check in," he promised, his voice quieter now. "If anything—" "Go," Clint said. "I'll take care of her." Strange hesitated just for a second. Then without another word, he stepped through the portal and was gone. The road to healing begins. The silence stretched between them. Clint moved through the kitchen, the sound of clanking dishes and the gurgling coffee maker, the only things grounding them to reality. Then, a whisper, a breath of a voice barely there. "Why?" Clint froze. Slowly, he turned. The ranger was looking at him now, not with clarity, not with understanding, but with pain, with a raw, open wound in her soul. Her voice cracked when she spoke again. "Why did he forget me?" Clint set the mug he had been holding down carefully. He met her shattered gaze, and he told her the only truth he could. Because he loved you too much to let you go any other way. The ranger's breath hitched. Her fingers curled into fists. She said nothing. And Clint just waited. Because she wasn't alone in this. Not anymore. The Archer's magic. Clint Barton had never needed magic to work miracles. He wasn't a god, a sorcerer, or a chosen one. He was just a man with a bow, a sharp aim, and the ability to see what others refused to. And right now, he saw her, the ranger. Not the woman who had fought beside gods, not the warrior who had faced trials that would break lesser beings. Not the person the universe seemed to keep testing over and over again. Just her. And she was drowning. But Clint had seen people drown before, and he had learned how to pull them back up. Bit by bit. Day by day. Until they remembered how to breathe again. Step 1. Coffee and silence. He didn't push. He didn't force words. He didn't ask her how she felt, or try to fix something that couldn't be fixed. He just sat across from her, sipping his coffee, reading the news, and letting her exist. Letting her get used to the quiet. Letting her realize that she was still here, and that she still had a choice. That life had not ended, even if it felt like it had. She didn't say much, didn't touch the coffee at first. Didn't react as he casually threw a knife into the table, embedding it an inch from her hand, just to see if she'd flinch. She didn't. But she noticed. And that was enough for now. Step 2. Routine. Clint's way of helping wasn't about grand gestures. It was about the little things. The small, unremarkable pieces of life that no one thought mattered, until they were gone. He set the rhythm. Nothing demanding. Nothing that felt like a burden. Just normalcy. Coffee at sunrise. A walk outside whether she wanted it or not. Weapons maintenance, because keeping your hands busy keeps your mind steady. And then, the part he knew would take the longest. Talking. Step 3. A well-placed joke. Clint leaned against the porch railing, stretching his arms above his head. "So listen," he said casually. "I'm thinking of starting a support group." The ranger shot him a tired, unimpressed glance. "A what?" "You know, for people who get their minds messed with by Loki." A long pause. Clint smirked, sipping his beer. "I'm thinking of calling it He's Hot, but also the Worst." The ranger blinked. Then, something almost like the breath of amusement escaped her. It wasn't a laugh. It wasn't even a smile. But it was something. And Clint? He took that as a win. Step 4. Sparring. And maybe a little violence. "All right, that's it," Clint said one morning, tossing a set of knives onto the table. "We're sparring." The ranger arched a brow. "Are we?" "Yup." "Why?" "Because I need to hit something, and so do you." He saw the resistance in her eyes, the way she wanted to argue, to say she wasn't ready, to say it wouldn't change anything. So Clint did what Clint did best. He pushed just enough. "Unless you're afraid I'll win," he said, smirking. That did it. The next moment, a knife was flying towards his face. He dodged, laughing. "There she is!" The ranger rolled her eyes. "You're insufferable." And yet, here we are. As they fell into a combat rhythm, and the movements became instinct again, Clint saw it. For the first time since Strange had brought her here, a spark, small, faint, but there. Because this wasn't about Loki. This wasn't about her. And Clint Barton would make damn sure she didn't forget who she was. Not now, not ever. The night she remembered how to breathe. The night was quiet, not the suffocating kind of silence she had grown used to. The hollow, aching absence of something that should have been there, but wasn't. This was different. This was peaceful. The safe house was dimly lit, a single candle flickering on the worn wooden table between them. Clint sat back in his chair, feet propped up on one another, spinning a knife between his fingers. The ranger sat across him, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she had barely touched. Clint was waiting. He was always waiting, because he knew this moment would come eventually. And tonight was the night. The moment she spoke. Her voice was quiet at first, soft. So much so that Clint almost missed it. I remember the moment it happened. He stopped spinning the knife, didn't speak, didn't move, just listened. She stared into the fire, her fingers tightening around the cup, her breath steady, but strained. I saw it, she continued. I saw what he did, what he chose. Clint leaned forward slightly. Tell me. She took a slow breath, and then she did. The memory of a sacrifice. Her words were measured, not rushed, not emotional, just raw truth. She told him about Loki standing before the first god, knowing he had no way to win. Told him about the way he had searched for another way, how he had tried to bargain with reality itself, how the ancient magic, the magic that had chosen him, offered him a way, but at a terrible price. To use my full power, you must give up your greatest power. Loki had hesitated. He had fought against it. But in the end, he had surrendered. Because he had never a choice at all. Because she meant more to him than his own memories, his own happiness, his own future. He gave me my life back, she whispered. And in doing so, he gave up everything. Her voice hitched, and for the first time in months, her eyes burned with tears she had been too numb to shed. A realization in the dark. Clint exhaled slowly, setting the knife down. That is a hell of a thing to carry, he murmured. She nodded. I didn't understand it at first. Her hands trembled slightly. I was so caught up in the pain of it, of losing him, of watching him look at me like I was nothing. Her breath shuddered, but she forced herself to continue. But now, I see it. She lifted her gaze to Clint, her expression stronger now, not healed, not whole, but anchored. He didn't just save my life. A slow inhale, a steady exhale. He gave it back to me. Clint watched her carefully. And what are you gonna do with it? The ranger's fingers tightened around the cup. Her heart was still broken. The pain was still there. But now there was something else there too. A purpose. I'm going to live, she said, voice steady, for him. The archer's nod. Clint held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, slowly, approvingly. Good, he said simply. Because wasting a gift like that would have been a shame. The ranger huffed a soft, almost breathless laugh, the first in so long. Clint smirked slightly, tilting his head. Did you just laugh? Shut up. You did. It was small, but it was there. Damn, I'm good at this. She shook her head, rolling her eyes, but she didn't deny it. And Clint? He considered this night a victory. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just existing. She was living, even if she didn't know where the road would lead next. The Thunderer's Dilemma. Thor stood at the edge of the Bifrost, his grip tight around Mjolnir, watching the cosmos tremble. He could feel it, every storm that crackled in the sky, every whisper of fear across the 9 realms. Every being that had once challenged Loki, now nothing more than the dust in his wake. Loki was unstoppable, unhinged. And for the first time in Thor's long life, he did not know if he could save him. Because this was not just Loki's rage. Not just another scheme, another game, another tangled web of lies and chaos. This was something else. Something fundamentally different. And if Thor stood in his way, it would mean his end, or Loki's. And he was not sure if he could do what needed to be done. So he turned to the only man who might have answers, the only one who might understand. The sorcerer's warning. The Sanctum Sanctorum was quiet when Thor stepped through the portal. Strange barely looked up as the god of thunder strode into the room, the tension radiating off him like a gathering storm. "You heard?" Strange said flatly. Thor's jaw tensed. The whole universe had heard. Strange finally looked up. "Then you know what I'm going to say." Thor narrowed his gaze. "Tell me anyway." The sorcerer sighed, leaning back, fingers steepled. "This didn't start with a war, or a throne, or some twisted ambition." His gaze darkened. "This started with a single choice." The story that changed everything. Thor listened. He listened as Strange told him everything. The sigil, the first god. How Loki fought something that should have not been fought. How Loki won, but at an unspeakable price. How he had given up his greatest power. How he had erased her from his life to save her. And how, in doing so, he had lost the one thing that had kept him tethered to himself. Thor's blood ran cold, because he understood. Oh gods, he understood. Loki was not just angry, not just lost. Loki was searching for something he could never find, for something that had been torn from him, for something that his heart still ached for, even if his mind no longer knew why. And that kind of emptiness, that kind of loss, could not be filled. No matter how many foes he destroyed, no matter how much havoc he unleashed upon the realms. Because Loki was trying to fight a war inside himself that he could never win. And the worst part? He didn't even know what he had lost. The question that had no answer. Thor exhaled slowly, bracing his hands on the table, his head bowing. "So what do we do?" Strange did not answer immediately, because the truth was, he did not know. This was not something that could be reversed, not something that could be fixed with magic or time or words. Loki was not cursed, he was not possessed. This was Loki as he was now, and the only way to bring him back was for him to remember what he had given up. And that was something beyond even Strange's power. So he met Thor's gaze, his voice quieter than before. "The question isn't what to do, Thor." A pause. A flicker of something almost like regret in the sorcerer's expression. "The question is what happened when she finds him first." Thor's heart skipped a beat, because that was something they were not ready for. The reckoning of gods. Thor could not wait any longer. His brother was unleashed upon the realms, tearing through anything and anyone that stood in his way, leaving nothing but fear and destruction in his wake. Loki had been many things in his long life. A trickster, a schemer, a liar, a warrior, a king, if only briefly. But this was not the brother he knew. This was something else. Something dangerous. Something unstoppable. Something even Thor could not name. But he had to try. Because if he did not, if no one stopped Loki, then soon there would be nothing left to save. The confrontation. The air cracked with lightning as Thor descended on the battlefield. A ruined city, its street burned and broken, the last remnants of another victory Loki would not remember. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and there, amidst the wreckage, amidst the shattered world he had left behind, Loki stood. He was calm, too calm. His armor was unscathed, his expression unreadable, his gaze sharp and unfeeling. He did not look like a man who had just walked through war. He looked like a god who had barely noticed it. And as Thor landed before him, gripping Mjolnir tightly in his fist, his heart clenched. Because for the first time, Thor was not sure if he was standing before his brother, or if he was standing before something else entirely. The pause before the storm. Loki lifted his gaze, and for a fraction of a second, time itself seemed to hold its breath. The brothers faced each other, not as they once had when they were children, racing through Asgard's golden halls. Not as they had in war, blade against hammer, fury against righteousness. Not as they had in past betrayals, in past forgivenesses, in past broken moments that neither of them could truly let go of. This was something new, something inevitable, something final. The world holds its breath. Far away, in the Sanctum Sanctorum, strange search for answers, poring over forgotten text, reaching into the depth of magic itself. But the answers he sought refused to be found. Far away, in a quiet safe house, the ranger laughed. A small, genuine sound, startled out of her by something Clint had just said. It was the first time in a long time that laughter felt natural, felt real, felt like something that belonged to her. And then the world stopped. The cosmos held its breath. Because this was the moment before everything changed. The moment before fate unraveled. The moment when everything that had been set in motion would finally collide. And when time began to move again, nothing would ever be the same. The moment before the storm. The world was still, silent, hanging in perfect balance on the razor's edge of something inevitable. Thor and Loki stood face to face, neither moving, neither speaking. No words were needed, because this was always going to happen. Because this had to happen. Because they had both known all along that the path Loki had taken could only lead here. Thor's grip on Mjolnir tightened. Loki's fingers curled at his sides, his magic whispering beneath his skin. Their eyes locked. And for a fleeting moment there was understanding. Not forgiveness, not mercy, not even love. Just understanding, because this was fate, and neither of them could stop it. The sorcerer's fury. In the Sanctum Sanctorum, Strange slammed the book shut, his breath sharp, his mind racing. Damn it, he hissed, pacing the floor. Everything had led to this moment. Everything had been set in motion long before any of them knew. And now? Now it was happening. Loki and Thor were standing on the precipice of something irreversible. And if someone didn't act, everything would fall apart. A conversation cut short. Clint and the Ranger sat at the small wooden table, coffee cooling, the warmth of laughter still lingering between them. The moment had been light, normal. Then they both stopped, mid-conversation, mid-motion, mid-breath. Because something had shifted. The atmosphere changed. The air felt too thick, too heavy. Like the universe itself had tensed. And then a portal ripped open before them. Strange stepped through, his expression dark, unyielding, absolute. "We must go, now." There was no hesitation. Clint was on his feet instantly, hand already reaching for his bow. The Ranger didn't ask, didn't question, didn't waste a single second. She simply moved, through the portal, through to whatever awaited them. Because deep inside her, she already knew where this was leading. And she was ready. The unleashing of a god. For a moment, a single, impossible moment, the universe stood still. Then Loki screamed, and the universe shattered. Thor had faced many things in his lifetime. He had faced monsters. He had faced gods. He had faced death itself. But nothing had ever felt like this. Because this was not just power. It was not just magic. This was loss. This was rage. This was grief so deep, so endless, so absolute, that it crushed him before he even knew what had happened. The sky split apart. The earth cracked beneath him. And Thor fell. Not because Loki had struck him down. Not because he had been wounded. But because he couldn't stand. The sheer weight of Loki's soul pressed upon him. Raw, unrelenting, devastating. Thor's hand trembled against the ground. His breath hitched in his throat. He had never felt anything like this. And for the first time in his long life, Thor was helpless. Not against a weapon, not against an army, but against Loki's pain. Because how? How could Loki still stand? How could he carry this weight, this soul-crushing, all-consuming void inside him, and not break beneath it? The scream that shook the cosmos. Loki's power erupted outwards, unleashed, untethered, unstoppable. His voice ripped through existence, a sound that was not just a sound, but something far deeper, something that made realms tremble, something that threatened to tear reality apart. Because this was not just rage, not just grief. This was the scream of emptiness itself, and the cosmos feared it. The moment everything collided, a portal tore open, bright golden light cut through the storm as Strange stepped through, followed by Clint, followed by her, the Ranger. She barely had time to take in the ruined landscape, barely had time to register Thor, kneeling, struggling to breathe, pressed into the earth beneath the power that no god should have to endure. Because all she saw was him, Loki. And he was nothing like the man she had known. Not anymore. Because the emptiness within him had finally found its voice. And it was devouring the world. The world was already breaking. Loki did not care. The sky burned, the air was too heavy, too thick with magic, too charged with the power of something that had gone far beyond gods and mortals. Thor was still kneeling, crushed beneath the sheer weight of Loki's fury, Loki's emptiness, Loki's grief. His fingers twitched, crackling energy twisting through the air. Power ready to end this. One final act. One final, irreversible decision. The power of a god who had nothing left to lose. And then something happened. Something impossible. The eyes that stopped a god. Loki's body froze. The magic at his fingertips coiled in the air, twisting, pulsing, waiting to be unleashed. And yet, it did not move. He did not move. Because in that moment, two eyes met his. And everything stopped. Loki stared. The rage inside him, the fire, the unrelenting storm that had carried him this far, vanished. Like it had never been there. The magic in his hand flickered, then dissolved into nothing. His breath caught. His pulse stuttered. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Loki faltered. She was there, unwavering, steady, unafraid, grounded. A figure standing in the midst of the ruin, in the center of a storm that should have consumed her. But she did not waver. She did not bow. She simply stood and looked at him, like she knew him, like she had always known him, like she was waiting. Loki's mind whirled, grasping at something he could not name. Who was she? And why? Why did she feel like something he had lost? Something he should remember. Something he should know. Time stood still. And for the first time since Loki had walked into the void, for the first time since he had torn apart the first god, since he had given up the greatest sacrifice of all, Loki did not know what to do. The storm was over. The power that had threatened to consume the cosmos had vanished into silence. And in that silence, she spoke one word, his name, Loki. A sound so simple, so small, and yet it shattered him. Loki staggered back, his breath catching in his throat as if he had been struck by a force he could not see. His body trembled, his hands shook. He did not understand. Why did it hurt? Why did his name, his own name, carry such weight in her voice? Why did it feel like something was breaking inside him? Why did it feel like he was being unraveled? She stepped forward. Her eyes never left his. Deep, knowing, understanding. And Loki could not move. Because those eyes, they knew him. And something inside him, something that had been buried, erased, torn away, knew her. His knees hit the ground. Loki was not a man who knelt. He had knelt before kings, before gods older than time itself. But this was different. He was falling. Not to surrender, not to beg, but because his body could no longer hold the weight of the truth. The emptiness that had hollowed him out, The void that had driven him to tear apart the realms, it was gone, and in its place there was her. She knelt in front of him, slow, deliberate, no fear, no hesitation. And then she wrapped her arms around him. A simple embrace, a gesture so soft, so familiar, so devastatingly real, that Loki broke. His hands clutched at her, as if anchoring himself to something that had slipped away from him long ago. His breath shook, his entire being trembled. Then she whispered his name again, Loki. And the universe shifted, and his mind changed. The flood of memory. It hit him all at once, like a dam breaking, a tidal wave crashing down, an entire lifetime being poured back into the hollowed-out space inside him. He remembered everything. Every battle, every trial, every moment they had stood side by side. Every time she had looked at him with trust in her eyes. Every time she had smiled at him, laughed with him, fought for him. Every quiet night by the fire. Every whispered truth. Every moment he had spent falling deeper and deeper into something he had never dared to name. He remembered her. Tanya. Not just a ranger, not just an ally. A warrior, a force of nature. But her. The woman he had given up everything for. The woman he had lost. The woman who had just given him everything back. Loki's fingers curled into the fabric of her tunic, his forehead pressing against her shoulder, his breath ragged and uneven. His body shook with something he could not name, something too big, too powerful, too terrifying. Because he remembered, and it was too much. She just held him. Steady, unwavering, real. And for the first time since he had lost everything, for the first time since he had been hollowed out and left as nothing but an empty god, playing a meaningless game, Loki was whole again. The moment the universe wept. The air was still, not with the weight of power, not with the echoes of battle, but with something far greater, something deeper, something that had been lost to time itself, and now had been found again. And the universe? The universe held its breath, because this moment was never supposed to happen. And yet, here they were. Thor exhaled slowly, pushing himself up. His body heavy, not with wounds, but with understanding. For the first time in his long life, Thor truly saw his brother, not just as a trickster, not just as a liar, a schemer, a burden, a shadow always slipping through his grasp. Not just Loki, the god of mischief, but as Loki. Loki who had sacrificed more than anyone could ever know. Loki who had carried an emptiness so vast, so consuming, that it had nearly unmade him. Loki who had just been whole again. And Thor understood. The witnesses to the impossible. Strange and Clint had seen many things, had stood against impossible forces, had faced down death itself, and yet, as they stepped closer, cautiously, not daring to disturb the moment unfolding before them, neither of them could speak. Because what they were seeing was not just a reunion, was not just a return. It was a miracle, something that should not have been possible. something that rewrote the very fabric of fate. And neither of them dared to break the silence. The moment of truth. Loki had not moved. He still knelt, his fingers curled into the fabric of her tunic, his breath uneven, his entire body trembling with the weight of what had just been given back to him. And the ranger? She still held him. She did not speak, did not move away, did not demand anything of him. She simply was. And that was enough. It was everything. And then, slowly, Loki lifted his head. His emerald gaze met hers. And in that instant, she saw it, everything. The recognition, the grief, the relief, the fear. The raw, aching, unfiltered emotion of a man who had spent an eternity in the void, only to finally wake up. And the universe wept. Because gods were not meant to feel like this. Gods were not meant to break like this. But Loki had. And now he was whole again. The words that could not be spoken. His hand moved, hesitant at first, as if afraid she would disappear again. As if afraid this was just another cruel trick of fate. His fingertips brushed her cheek, the slightest of touches. And he felt her warmth. He felt her realness. Felt everything. His throat was tight, words forming, but none of them were enough. How could they be? How could any words possibly hold the weight of everything he had just regained? But then she smiled, soft, steady, real. I told you I'd always be here. And Loki broke. Because she always had. Because even when he had forgotten her, she had never forgotten him. And for the first time in his life, he finally believed it. The moment the universe moved again. The world shifted. The storm that had hung over them was gone. The fight was over. The pain remained. But it was no longer unbearable, because now they carried it together. And when Loki finally spoke, his voice was not the voice of a god. It was not the voice of a king. Not the voice of a liar or a trickster or a villain. It was just his voice, soft, vulnerable. I remember. And the ranger? She nodded, her hand still against his cheek, her touch still grounding him. I know. And the universe? The universe exhaled, because against all odds, against time, against fate, against the will of God's magic itself, they had found each other again, and nothing would ever break them again. The storm had passed, the sky was still once more. The ground no longer trembled beneath Loki's power. The realms no longer held their breath in fear. The world, the universe, moved on, slowly, quietly, because even the most earth-shattering moments must eventually give way to the rhythm of time. The aftermath of a miracle. Thor was the first to exhale. It was a quiet sound, a sound of relief, a sound of understanding, a sound of letting go. He watched as Loki and the ranger remained where they were, locked in a moment that only they could understand. And for the first time, Thor did not interrupt, did not demand an answer, did not ask his brother to explain himself. Because for once, he did not need an explanation. He simply understood. The Sorcerer and the Archer. Clint let out a slow, careful breath, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't sure if he should say something. Wasn't sure if there was anything to say. Strange, standing beside him, was still as a statue, processing, analyzing, understanding the weight of what had just happened. This wasn't a reunion. This was something far bigger, something that should not have been possible, something that had rewritten fate itself. And Strange, a man who had spent years trying to untangle the threads of destiny, did not know what it meant. Not yet, but he knew one thing for certain. The world had changed, and the consequences of this moment had yet to unfold. The quiet between them. Loki and the Ranger did not speak. They did not need to. She still held him. He still clung to her, grounding himself in the reality of her presence. Slowly, gently. She ran her fingers through his dark hair, a soothing motion. A reminder that he was here. That she was here. That this was real. And Loki, who had spent months searching for something he could not name, finally understood what had been missing. And it was her. It had always been her. The first words after everything. The Ranger was the first to break the silence, her voice soft, steady, a whisper against the still air. We should go home. Loki stilled at the word. Home. He did not know where that was anymore. Not Asgard, not the throne. Not any place he had once thought he belonged. But here, with her, maybe that was enough. So he nodded, slowly, carefully. And for the first time in what felt like eternity, Loki allowed himself to breathe. The universe moves on. The world no longer stood still. The storm had passed. The fight was over. Now there was only the future. And what that meant, what that would become, none of them knew yet. But for now, for this moment, they simply let the world move on. Slowly, quietly, and together. The warmth of home. The golden light of the portal flickered softly as all four of them stepped through, leaving the battlefield behind. No more destruction, no more rage, no more emptiness. Only the quiet embrace of the cabin. The scent of wood, earth, of old books and lingering herbs, of something familiar, something grounding. And for the first time in what felt like eternity, Loki let the tension in his shoulders ease, because this place was safe. The quiet work of old friends. Clint vanished into the kitchen without a word, rolling up his sleeve, moving as if he had always belonged here. A habit, a rhythm, something normal against the midst of the extraordinary. He rummaged through the cupboards, pulling together whatever he could find, muttering to himself as he worked. Stephen, with a quiet flick of his wrist, ignited the fire in the hearth. The warmth of the flames filled the space instantly, flickering light casting long shadows against the wooden walls. For a moment, he simply watched the fire. Then, without a word, he turned and followed Clint, giving Loki and the Ranger the space they needed. Because they both understood. This moment wasn't for them. This was theirs. Loki and the Ranger. The ones who had defied fate. The ones who had found each other again. She was gentle. No rush, no words. Just a soft, steady touch as she guided him to the couch, where the fire's warmth was already wrapping around them like a quiet embrace. Loki sat down slowly, his movement hesitant, as if he wasn't sure this moment was real, as if he was still waiting for it to slip away. The firelight danced in her eyes as she looked at him, and for a moment, a long, fragile moment, he just looked back, taking her in, committing this to memory. Because this was real. She was here, and she had never stopped being here. And then, a whisper, soft, barely audible, as if he was afraid saying it aloud might break the spell. Tanya. A name that meant everything. It was not just a name, not to him, not to her. It was everything that had been, everything they had lost, everything they had found again. She knelt beside him, her fingers curling gently around his. A small, simple gesture. And yet it anchored him to the present. Her thumb brushed against his knuckles. Slow, soothing. No demands, no expectations. Just her. Loki exhaled a shaky breath. His other hand coming up, hesitantly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ears. His fingers lingering against her cheek. He had forgotten this. Forgotten the way her skin was warm beneath his touch. Forgotten the way she felt so steady even when the world had crumbled around them. Forgotten what it was like to not be alone. "You're real," he murmured, his voice barely above a breath. A statement, a confession, a desperate need for reassurance. She nodded, tilting her head into his touch. "I'm here," she whispered, "and I always will be." And Loki closed his eyes for a moment, letting himself believe it, letting himself breathe, letting himself feel whole again.